Up to 15.
Oh, we did?
Yeah, let me just check the email. Because he told me later.
Alrighty,
Check your email, what I sent.
I'm ready.
How you doing?
Let's get this party started. All right, so what we're going to talk about today is parts of chapter 12 and chapter 13. So we're going to talk a little bit more about market entry strategies. We talked a little bit about that. I think it was 2 classes ago. We talked about modes of entry. So whether we refer to it as a mode of entry or market entry strategies, we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. We're also going to talk about some of the key concepts from chapter 13, which include the adoption curve model, which we said also is sometimes referred to as diffusion of innovation, which is a model that was created by Everett Rogers, which is very insightful and something that we need to internalize. We're also going to talk about country of origin and the significance for us as global marketers. And we're also going to talk about branding. So I want to talk to you a little bit about, from chapter 13, there's some information in there about the value of some of the top brands worldwide. So we're going to talk a bit about that. And then if we have time, we'll go over the second quiz, quiz B. All right, so what are some of the modes of entry that we talked about? Because remember, we're thinking about marketing and business from a global perspective. So it's not enough to say that we want to sell our products everywhere in the world. If that's our objective, then we need to do a country analysis. We need to segment the market and determine which segments we're going to try to penetrate. But the question is, how are we going to penetrate those segments? Because remember, we said that there's 4 key growth strategies: market penetration, market development, diversification, and new product development. Market penetration is increasing the sale of our existing products in existing markets. So how would we do that? How would we achieve market penetration?
Joint ventures?
Well, before we get to that, first let's talk about some of the tactics. But in terms of market penetration, so we're not up to market development yet. Market development is increase the sales of existing products in new markets, and that's what we're going to be talking a lot about. But first, just to ground us, how are we going to increase the sales of existing products in existing markets? That's known as market penetration. Go ahead, Daniel.
Pretty much by manipulating the 4 Ps of price or promotion, placement, etc.
Absolutely. So changing different marketing mix elements is going to enable us to ideally penetrate a particular market. So in other words, increase the sales of our existing products in our existing markets. So what Daniel is suggesting, if we want to sell more of the existing product and the market is elastic, then we could lower the price. We could lower the price, and our expectation would be that we would sell more units at a lower price. Does that seem plausible? What do you guys think? Right? In most cases that are what we consider to be consumer products, right? Most consumer products are elastic markets. Not all, right? We said that some products are inelastic, but it's on a continuum. So in other words, it could be extremely elastic, somewhat elastic, inelastic, or let's say somewhat inelastic, inelastic, extremely inelastic. So I mentioned that because we had a little bit of a discussion about, well, what about if you would increase your consumption, but Daniel wouldn't? So, of course, we're making some generalizations about a market when we say that the market is elastic, that it's price sensitive. Well, maybe for Stepansky, price needs to go down 20% for him to buy the product. Maybe Daniel, the price only has to go down 10% before he would buy the iPad, for example. So don't let that throw you off, that it's not perfectly elastic or perfectly inelastic. Of course, it's, like I said, on a continuum. So elasticity could be 1, or it could be 0.9, or it could be 0.8, or 0.7, or 0.6, etc. Right? That's an indication of how elastic the market is. But we could also increase the money we spend on advertising. So price, promotion, product, we could add more features and benefits, and distribution within the existing market, we could get distribution at more outlets. But that being said, that's a market penetration strategy. We want to talk about market development. How do we increase the sale of existing products in new markets? So if we're an American-based company, how do we increase the sale of our products in Japan, in Hong Kong, in Israel, in France, in Africa, in the Netherlands? So we need to be able to penetrate those markets. And there needs to be a mode of entry. How are we going to break into that market? That's what we're going to talk about a bit more today. So what do you think? What would be one of the first ways that we could try to penetrate a market, let's say, outside of the US? For an American company, and we're really focused on being a global company, being a multinational company. And remember, we said the battle cry of global marketers is to think globally and act locally. So what would be, let's try and address these in terms of the level of risk for us as a company. Because each of these modes of entry, each of these market entry strategies is going to have a certain level of risk for the company. So what would be the least risky mode of entry? What would be the least risky thing that we could do to sell our products in France or some country outside of the US? Go ahead, Daniel.
Or just to export it. Simply to set up, say, franchising or joint ventures, not necessarily setting up a facility or plant or putting that much asset investment into the area, but rather to do something more like that, where you're.
Well, you mentioned three different three different modes of entry there. But before we get to exporting, because there's a certain risk associated there, which is we could lose the inventory. So certainly, one of the less risky modes of entry is exporting. But we would still have the potential risk of we shipped $1 million worth of product to a particular market and the boat sank, it was hijacked, whatever it is, we lost the inventory. But before that, what would be the least risky? What do you think, Noah?
Market research.
But what would be the entry strategy? What would be the way that we would penetrate that market?
I think it's selling to people who, selling to exporters, selling it to people who take it, who go on their own to take it into the other countries. I forget what exactly it's called.
How about this?
Right there.
How about if we have a virtual store?
Wouldn't that be direct? Direct selling?
It's direct selling. So that's a way for us to penetrate the market. We have a website, and what we do is we promote that website in that particular market. We don't put any inventory at risk. It's a virtual store, and sometimes if we give enough lead time, if we give ourselves enough lead time and we expect that the customers will be okay, that we say, let's say the product will ship in 4 weeks, we don't need to hold inventory. So in other words, we don't want to produce product and hope that they will buy. So there's a difference between make to order and make to stock. What's the difference between make to order and make to stock? Go ahead, Daniel.
Make to order is you build it when the order comes in, like,
Right.
like In-N-Out Burger.
Right, so make to order. So ideally, we would like our internet store, our virtual store, to be make to order. So we want to sell in France, we want to sell in Japan, we want to sell in Iraq, we want to sell in Israel. Ideally, it would be a make to order business where we're not going to build inventory until we get the order. So we're not tying up working capital, we're not tying up cash. And then make to stock, go ahead Daniel, continue.
It would be like McDonald's, a place that every like 30 minutes creates a certain number of stores and then holds them to be able to give them immediately when the order comes in. That keeps an inventory regularly.
So it could be McDonald's, or it could be a clothing retailer, for example. So for example, a very obvious, and McDonald's may not be obvious to the observer, although what Daniel is saying is accurate, but if you go into any, let's say, clothing store, and you see piles of jeans and piles of t-shirts, then obviously that's make to stock. Right? You're making the product with the expectation that they will come.
Yes, a mass production.
Right. Questions about that? So you see the difference? So ideally our internet, our virtual store is going to be make to order. But even if it's not make to order, at least the inventory is in our control. So if we do make to stock, we still have possession of the inventory. It's not on a boat on its way to Iraq, Colombia, where else might it go? Italy. And this is something that we need to be sensitive to and consider seriously. Because remember, we had mentioned previously that there are certain market dynamics that we need to be sensitive to. Political dynamics, legal dynamics, regulatory dynamics, cultural dynamics.
Religious.
So, absolutely. So, in some markets, it's a very real possibility that our manufacturing facility or our warehouse could be hit by a Scud missile. Now in the US, generally we don't anticipate something like that happen, right? That something like that would happen. But in other markets, certainly that's a very real possibility. So we need to understand the level of political instability in a given market. So that's why it's important to understand we have possession of the inventory. It's not sitting in a warehouse. We don't anticipate any civil unrest or riots, etc., that would cause damage to our inventory. So internet is the least risky for the reasons that we mentioned. What else? Let's take Daniel's example, which is a good one, Daniel, but I think this one, you agree, would be the least risky, even less risky than being an exporter or importer. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Because being an exporter definitely is a less risky option, which means really the worst case scenario is we lose the inventory. If we have a mode of entry such as a virtual store, then there's very little chance that we would lose the inventory. But as an exporter and importer, the worst case scenario is we could lose the inventory. Sometimes that could be $50,000. Sometimes that could be $50 million. It depends. But that's certainly less risky than when we go down here, the other extreme is FDI. What is FDI? Not FBI. You guys know what that is, right? FDI. What is FDI?
Something direct investment.
I hear somebody saying it.
Foreign direct investment.
Right, foreign direct investment, which is the most risky because what that suggests is that you actually build a manufacturing facility in a particular market. And why is that risky? Because what if the facility was hit by a Tomahawk cruise missile and you destroyed the whole facility? You know, it's one thing to say you lost $50,000 worth of inventory or $50 million worth of inventory. If you lost the whole facility, that might be $50 billion that we lost.
Where's the D-set?
Foreign direct investment. Does that make sense? You guys clear on that?
So one company still do that.
Because what they do is a country analysis, and they determine that the level of risk is acceptable. That the reason why they're going to build a manufacturing facility there is because they don't think there's going to be a civil war. They don't think that the country is going to be invaded. They don't anticipate any missiles hitting the manufacturing facility. They think that the country is politically stable. It's not run by a dictator. They have free elections. They say, why wouldn't we build a manufacturing facility there? Well, there's reasons why, but I mean, they're not concerned about the manufacturing facility being destroyed. So we have to look at it on a market-by-market basis. It's not enough to just say, oh, we want to be a global marketer. Well, where? Where are you going to sell your product? And you really have to do your homework and analyze each country. Now, importantly, and we're going to talk about some of the other modes of entry, foreign direct investment is not an option in every market. So that's got to come out in our country analysis that it's going to tell us it's a communist country. You can't just go there. You can't just go to China, and I've been there many times. You can't just go there, find yourself a 1 million square foot field, and build a facility. Now, in Oklahoma, you could do that, right? You could buy nobody's going to stop you from buying a 1 million square foot field. You'll have to get a permit to be able to build there. Now, it might be that it's a residential area, and they're not going to allow you to build a manufacturing facility. But if you pick the location correctly, and there's no zoning issues, right, it would be very easy to find yourself a field where you could build a manufacturing facility, somewhere like, let's say, in the Midwest. And nobody would stop you if you have the money. You could buy the field, and assuming, like I said, there's no other issues with the municipality, and you don't have to bribe the mayor of the town, which in some markets that happens. You can get a permit. It might actually only be $100. And in fact, the town or the city might actually give you some tax incentives where you wouldn't have to pay property tax for 10 years so that you would build a facility in their city and employ people. But that's not an option in every market. Once you go outside of the US, there are some limitations. And China is certainly a good example of that. There's been tremendous political reform. A lot of positive things have happened in China, but still it is a communist country. It's absolutely, and I'm happy that there's been more political freedoms given to the people. The standard of living has increased. but it's still not even close to the standard of living in the United States, or what generally we look at as the level of per capita income. But so that would be a limitation, even if we wanted to, right? Even if we said, yeah, coach, I got it. I want to build my manufacturing facility in China. I don't think any bombs are going to go off. They say, no, we're not going to let you. So that's something we need to consider. And then another thing that Daniel mentioned was being a distributor. So are we all clear, though, on what it means to be an exporter? Right? If we're exporting the product to a particular market, that means we don't have a manufacturing facility there. We're basically shipping our product to that particular market. Questions?
Is there a problem with being just an exporter? I know, I assume.
No, there's no problem. That's perfectly fine. And in fact, what we're going to observe is, over time, what happens is companies very often start off here, and then as they grow and as they learn about the market and as they develop the market and as they figure out or have a better understanding of market needs, they move lower and lower down the continuum. So they start off, maybe they have a virtual store, try to get a sense as to how the product would sell in that particular market. You know, one of the things we could do is have a test market. Well, we could have a physical test market. We could try and open up a shop, open a company-owned store and try to sell the product. Or we could sell through third-party retail.
How is that not foreign direct investment if you're opening up a company store?
Foreign direct investment typically refers to building a manufacturing facility.
Okay. What if it's a product that doesn't?
Like a type of significant infrastructure. But if you're opening a company store, all that means is that you're renting a shop in China. That's that's not significant enough. When we think about foreign direct investment, we're thinking about on a big scale.
So for a provider of services rather than a provider of goods, what would be an example of foreign direct investment, taking out the manufacturing plant from the equation?
So then you would have to have a sales organization, which could be a very significant investment. You might have to have, you might build a call center, for example, where you might have 500 people working in a call center providing customer service support. Let's say you have, what would be a good example? Well, either financial services or some other type of services you suggested where you feel it's necessary to be in market. Now we could try to penetrate the market through a distributor. Now remember, each level in a value chain provides a particular service. They provide a particular benefit. They play a particular role. And what happens is that, as a result, they earn a certain amount of margin. So you have the producer of raw materials, you have the processor of raw materials, you have the manufacturer, the distributor, the retailer. That would be a typical value chain. Each of those middlemen, if you will, each of those in the value chain are going to earn a certain amount of margin. Now, based on that, you can see why companies have a tendency to vertically integrate. That means if you're the manufacturer, then you might also want to be the retailer. or you might want to be the processor of raw materials. And also, let me clarify, when we use the term raw materials, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about cotton or gold, whatever the material is. So in accounting, we use the term direct labor and direct materials. Excuse me, sometimes we use the term raw materials. It doesn't mean that it has to be iron ore or something like that, right? It's just the materials that you use to make the product. And it could be in some intermediate state. So it could be what we call work in process or partially completed goods that we use to produce our product.
Why would you want to do that? Why do you want to do that?
Do what?
Produce your own.
Why would you want to vertically integrate?
Yeah.
Ah, okay, good question. Evan says, why would we want to vertically integrate? Let's say that we're the manufacturer. We sell the product, right? We sell the product to retailers at $100. The retailer sells the product for $200. So they have a $100 markup, 100% markup. Now, if we could be the manufacturer and the retailer, then what's going to happen is that we're going to earn that 100% markup. So it's very common, it's become more common, I should say, for a company to manufacture a particular product and have a chain of company stores as well as sell through third-party retail. A good example is Kenneth Cole. Kenneth Cole, you familiar with the designer Kenneth Cole? Kenneth Cole has over 400 company stores, which is actually surprising. That's a little unusual to have that many company stores because it takes years to identify the locations, negotiate a lease, retrofit the location, and be able to open up and run as a business. Now, if you want to be at a prime location, it's not that easy to get a store. I mean, people that have a lot of the stores that are on Fifth Avenue, for example, in Manhattan, a lot of these people, they have 25-year leases. They're not signing, once they're there, they're not going to sign like a one-year lease for a variety of reasons. One of them is that it's strategic as part of their positioning to be a luxury brand, for example. So there's stores on Fifth Avenue that are not profitable. And you think, well, how is that possible? It's possible because the rent is very high, but for them, what are they getting? How do they justify that expense? Because they're creating a unique, favorable, and strong association with Fifth Avenue, which represents luxury, status, prestige, and they're associating that with their brand. So even if they're not profitable as a store, there's other benefits, there's other reasons for them to be there. Now, once you position yourself as a luxury brand, it's unlikely in the short term that you would try to reposition yourself as a lower end or economy brand. Not that it doesn't happen. So people with a retail shop at premium locations have very long leases because they understand that the shop doesn't need to be profitable for it to be worthwhile for them. So how are we going to get a shop? We decide that we want to open up a shop there. It's not so easy. So in other words, my point is that to say that you open up 400 company stores, like, oh, we'll do that in the next 2 months, 3 months. You know what? Give us 6 months. What are you kidding? That takes like 10 years. Really? I'm not exaggerating. To do that is like at least 10 years to be able to pull that off. So it's kind of impressive that they've been able to achieve that, and it's taken them a long time, one store by one store by one store. But they also sell through third-party retailers, so they also sell their products through Macy's, for example, and Bloomingdale's. So that's why you would vertically integrate. That was Evan's question. Why would you vertically integrate? Because if you're selling in your own company stores, now you're making, on top of what you're making, the difference between your standard cost and your wholesale price, what you sell it to retailers for, you're also making 100% on the wholesale price as the retailer. So is that compelling? So basically, sometimes you hear people use the term cutting out the middleman. Well, so you cut out the middleman, you become the middleman, so to speak, right? So you become the retailer. But why is that, what's the issue there? Why is that not as simple as it seems to say, you know what, I'm just not going to sell in third-party retail. What I'm going to do, I'm going to work with my coach, we're going to open up this business, and we're just going to open up one shop. So what's the disadvantage of doing that as opposed to, let's say, trying to sell the product and get distribution at Walmart? Go ahead.
A lot of times third-party retailers have a lot more market share and power, and so being the sole shop is not going to really help.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were to get on the Walmart planogram, if they gave you full store distribution, I think we mentioned previously that sometimes they'll do a test depending on the product or the product type. They might put you in 500 stores, for example, to see how it sells. If you get chain-wide distribution, that means like almost overnight, you have distribution in 2,500 stores. That's definitely a big advantage to have, like for example, in the United States, to have distribution, national distribution, pretty much overnight. Now they have certain dates that they reset planograms in different sections of the store, different departments. So by the time that you show them the product and you actually have distribution, it could be 6 months, but it's not 10 years. So that's definitely an advantage to having distribution at third-party retail. But what Kenneth Cole did is they want to have the best of both worlds. Now, what's the challenge there if you're going to try and do that? What's the challenge in selling product in your store, your company-owned store, and selling product at a third-party retailer, whether it's Macy's or Bloomingdale's or Saks or Walmart or Kmart or Target, wherever it is? What's the issue there? Why would the third-party retailers have an issue? What would their concern be? What do you think?
You already have a store that sells those products. Why do you need? It's just going to take away from the store.
Yeah, it could minimize their sales, so you're competing against them, right? That's what's basically happening. You're competing against them, so if you're selling the product in your store and we're selling it in our store, then we're competing against each other. That's certainly one issue.
So pricing and inventory you get mixed up?
Right, so that they might be concerned that in our company store we're going to sell it for a lower price, and certainly as a manufacturer and a retailer we certainly have enough room in terms of margin to be able to do that. We could certainly underprice them, so that would be a concern, and so we need to address that. We need to either make sure that we're not selling the identical products and or we're definitely not selling it for less than what our retail partners are selling the product for.
When you give it to a retailer, they can make up the price.
Say it again about what?
When you give it to a retailer, they can make up the price of your product.
You give them a suggested retail price. If they want to charge more, they could do that. You would like to think that your suggested retail price is based on research that tells us what the customer is willing to pay. So just to say, well, they told us to sell it at $200, but we're going to sell it for $250. Well, maybe at $250, people are not going to buy the product. it's less of an issue charging more than the manufacturer suggested retail. It's more of an issue selling lower than the manufacturer suggested retail. That's when there's a lot of concern. Because instead of you selling it for less than them, you should be worried that they're not selling it less than us. And usually there's a contract that you have with retailers called MAP pricing, MAP, which is minimum advertised price. So that, in other words, if we said the manufacturer suggested retail is $200, so you have to have a MAP price associated with that, which might be $200, or it could be $175. But what happens if it's a very popular product and they want to create foot traffic to their store, and instead of selling the product at $200, they decide they're going to sell the product at $150, or maybe even $100. Maybe they sell it at their cost, which would be, what, a loss leader, to get people into the store. So they're going to come into the store to buy our product, and then the expectation is once they're there, they're going to buy other products at full price.
Also, a lot of times at like full stores that represent a single brand, like Calvin Klein, Van Cole, whatever, they have services that are included in that product. You buy something that people helping you out. So what a lot of people actually, which gives it somewhat of a markup because you're paying for a lot more than just the clothes. So what some people do is they'll like do that, they'll try on the suit or whatever they're doing, and then they'll leave and they'll buy it for way cheaper somewhere else. So that's also a problem that they face.
Mm-hmm.
And like with competition who's retailing there even cheaper.
Right, so they might just be shopping around.
Right.
And there's other services you're saying that they get. Right. Yeah, that's a good point. What are we missing here? Daniel also, I think, mentioned licensing, franchising.
Joint ventures.
Right, joint ventures. What is the issue with licensing? What would, go ahead.
I was going to say maybe a little bit of loss of control.
Absolutely. So let's say, for example, we're licensing our brand in a particular market. That means we give them authority to use
Our name.
Yeah, our name. But as you're pointing out, we're losing some of the control. So we're not directly responsible for manufacturing the product. Basically, we're getting paid a royalty or some sort of licensing fee from the company.
Right, but imagine they're doing a sloppy job, but we have this, we have like a higher brand name or whatever, a higher expectation, and they're doing a sloppy job. People are going to say, oh, this is a bad brand.
Right, absolutely. So it could tarnish our brand name. So if our brand is a luxury premium brand, and we license it to a company, remember, we're not manufacturing the product, we're not exporting the product, it's not foreign direct investment, we don't have a distribution center or a sales network in that particular market. We're licensing our brand to a company who already has a distribution center, who already has a manufacturing facility in that market, who already has a sales team. They're going to produce the product and they're going to use our brand. So they're going to wrap their product in our brand. But as you're pointing out is, what if they manufacture a shoddy product, a product that's of low quality? That's going to have a negative impact on our brand image.
Well, usually the licensing or franchising usually involves the purchase of products from the larger parent company.
The larger parent company being?
Being the franchisor. The franchisee is usually purchasing most of their stuff from the franchisor.
I mean, unless it could be like a restaurant, for example.
Right.
So,
Well, that's one of the reasons, certainly, why franchisors do that, right? To address your concern. Why, if it's a McDonald's or a Subway, why they even make you buy like the cups from
From them. For consistency.
and certainly right, and the food and so forth. That's absolutely their concern. They don't want you, buying your own chicken and so forth. But also keep in mind that for a franchise, it's supposed to be a turnkey process. That's what makes something franchisable, is that the process can be replicated again and again with the same level of quality and consistency over time.
Well, that's why, though, the people purchasing from the larger franchising company is what creates that turnkey effect, I believe.
Absolutely. So you're selling to them a system for making burgers and fries.
Yeah.
And not only are you going to tell them how to make the product and give them the proprietary equipment and teach them the steps that presumably are efficient in making burgers. So when you think about it, you might think, what's so complicated about making a burger? I take the burger, I flip it to the left, and then I flip it to the right. Then I do this, that, and the other thing. But the thing is, when you're making 5 burgers, you could flip it left, right, up, down, whatever you want. When you have to make 50,000 in a week, then all of a sudden, well, now it matters. Now it matters. If I flip it this way and that way, then that's going to take up an extra 15 seconds. And that doesn't sound like a lot. But when you're working 3 shifts at a restaurant, not you per se, but when the restaurant is open 3 shifts, so 24 hours, then it's going to make a difference. So we want to learn. That's one of the reasons why we're going to pay $250,000, $1 million, $5 million for, let's say, a fast food restaurant franchise, is because the franchisor presumably has already figured that out. Don't flip left and right, just flip left. 1 squirt of this, 1 squirt of ketchup, only 2 pickles, not 3. You say, what, are you kidding me? 3 pickles? Yes, because at the end of the year, that's $50,000 worth of pickles. Right? So they figured everything out in advance. They have a process that works, a business model that's profitable, and they definitely want to control. Every McDonald's or whatever the restaurant is that you go to, the food will be of the same quality. And even if it's not expensive, it will be of like quality, and generally they would consider their food to be high quality. It doesn't mean it's gourmet, but they consider it to be high quality. Food is not spoiled. It's at a certain price point, but the food is of a good quality.
Also, what has to be taken into account is that in different countries, so for example, let's say you were talking about McDonald's, different countries, people have different, different tastes. So
Absolutely.
Or religious restrictions. So
Absolutely.
While in India they won't eat cows, so they'll be eating
Right.
Mutton burgers or something.
Absolutely.
So,
That's
they
an
won't be able
excellent
to
point.
get it from the the main distributor. They won't be able to get it from the mother McDonald's company.
Right. So that's an excellent point that you made. Certainly, the secret to McDonald's success is in large part to the fact that they thought globally, but they act locally, which is what you're saying, right? They said, in India, yeah, we want to sell burgers and fries, but wait a minute, in India the cow is sacred. It could be a burger, but it's certainly not going to be a beef burger. And when we sit here and talk about it, it sounds like a blinding glimpse at the obvious. But you'd be surprised how many big companies make big mistakes. So what you're saying is not obvious, it's brilliant, really. And that's something that they've done time and time again, is they've demonstrated that they are world-class global marketers. That they do a country analysis, they understand all the political, legal, regulatory, cultural issues, and they operate a restaurant that addresses those. And so in each local market, they customize the menu. They still have a Big Mac, right? Because that's one of their hallmark products, right? Is the Big Mac. And believe it or not, there's a market for American culture. So people want to buy a Big Mac. They want to eat at McDonald's. despite what we might hear sometimes about anti-American sentiment. There's definitely a market for American products. There's definitely a market, for example, for Levi's jeans. Because Levi is the company, the only company actually, that could claim to be the inventor of denim. And, importantly, this is a good segue into this topic about country of origin. People are willing to pay a premium for Levi's jeans outside of the US because, not despite, because of the fact that it's for a long time been made in America, it's an American brand, and part of its unique selling proposition is also that it's the inventor of denim. Now, how much do Levi's, a typical pair of Levi's, sell for in the United States? You know, let's say Brooklyn, wherever. Los Angeles,
$35.
30 to 50.
right? $35, $50. Outside of the US, there's many markets where Levi's sell for $300 US. Not pesos,
I heard.
not rupee,
Yes, Pansky.
right? $300 US. Why? Because of this country of origin, that people, there is definitely a market for American culture. And Levi's is a part of American culture.
So why isn't food then like that? So why can't McDonald's then just make, instead of like a Big Mac being, I don't know how much it costs, $1, why do they charge you $4?
Well, there's something that's also interesting. There's something called the Big Mac Index, and what it looks at is how much is a Big Mac in like 100 countries. I bet you never even thought that it's like 100 countries, right? I mean, isn't that like blow your mind? I always, whenever I look at annual reports and I see them say distributed in 144 countries, I'm like, really? 144 countries? Isn't that amazing? Now that's global marketing at its best. And so McDonald's has been successful in doing that. But one of the challenges is definitely has to do with purchasing power parity. Are people going to be able to afford our product in their market? So are we able to charge a premium for a Big Mac in Russia or China? That's something that we need to decide. Usually not. In most cases, the index reveals that they lower the price because of the limited disposable income of the people in that particular market. But for other types of goods, that's not the case. So they don't have money for a hamburger, but they got money for jeans. Typical, right? Isn't that true? Aren't there people that shop like that? Certain things that are important to them. And you know, they pay a premium for jeans. You know, you buy a pair of jeans now, $350, they're already torn. I mean, isn't that crazy? But that's a different issue in terms of consumer behavior. So, but I want to clarify something that that Daniel was alluding to. Yeah, franchising is a type of licensing, but what I was suggesting is something a little bit different than a franchise. So I was suggesting that basically they're just licensing the brand, and they have production capability, and we just collect a royalty. Certainly franchising, typically the franchisor is very much involved in the process, in the production of the goods and services. So something that we need to be aware of. Remember, what we're trying to do is get our foot into the market. We're trying to penetrate the market. So these are different ways that we could do that. So licensing may be one way to do that. How do we build awareness? Certainly we could advertise, but it certainly can be very compelling to have our product on the shelf in that particular market. And if we don't engage in foreign direct investment, or that's not an option, or we decide not to export the product, or sell on the internet, then maybe licensing is the way to go. And then once we gain momentum, to explore other modes of entry. So keep in mind, when we talk about a mode of entry, selecting a mode of entry, that's not for the life of the company. We need a starting point. How are we going to begin to penetrate a particular market? We deploy a certain mode of entry or market entry strategy. Maybe we use that for a year or 2 years, and then it's okay to switch to a different mode of entry. Ideally, I would like to think that we had planned that out as part of our 5-year plan, that for 2 years we're going to sell on the internet. Then in year 3, we're going to, export, and so on. So that's something that we had anticipated. Questions? Joint venture. What is one of the typical disadvantages of a joint venture? Because basically what that means, if we have a joint venture, is, remember, think about it in terms of how do we get into a particular market? How do we penetrate a particular market? Remember, we don't have a manufacturing facility. We don't have a distribution network. We don't have a sales team there. We don't have a warehouse or distribution center. Now, a joint venture is supposed to be a win-win. So we have something, and our partner has something. So how does that play out? What is it that we offer, and what is it that they might offer in a particular situation?
Often there could be legal arguments between the two parties that could be a major disadvantage.
Yeah, so there can be confrontation or disagreement amongst the parties. And even if you have a contract, of course you're going to have a contract, but even though you have a contract, you hear people say, well, sue me. Like, what does it mean to have a contract with another company? Of course you could sue them, but that doesn't mean that they didn't violate the terms of the agreement. They still violated the terms of the agreement, let's say, and we've still been disadvantaged. So so tell us just briefly, who could tell us, like in a nutshell, what are the advantages of a joint venture, and also what is one of the disadvantages?
I was going to say an advantage is you have a company that already knows the market.
Absolutely, that's definitely a plus.
And disadvantage is you're giving up half of the control. You lose a significant amount of power.
You give up some control. It doesn't necessarily need to be 50%.
Right, could be.
Each party brings something or some bundle of technology, know-how, talent, experience, insight, market access. Each party brings something. So it should be a win-win. And then, that being said, what would be another disadvantage then?
You're forfeiting a level of your own personal control in the market to them by also offering them that expertise.
Yeah, so explain that a little bit more, because that's important. Well, what is the issue about sharing with our partner the expertise, which could be some type of proprietary manufacturing technology or proprietary recipe or formula?
You are giving them that kind of what I guess would be considered a trade secret.
Absolutely, yep, it's a trade secret.
And then also on top of that, you're also giving them, by entering a joint venture, you're giving them a certain degree to actually change it in the market. Meaning if they see it that it needs to be certain things need to be adjusted, they may have the right, depending on the contract worked out ahead of time, to be able to do that. So you're actually putting your own brand at risk by giving another person a certain degree of control over it.
So absolutely, all of those points are very well taken, and we'd like to think that it's a win-win, but that's not always the case. So one of the challenges would also be, and this I think also part of what you were alluding to, is that there could be conflict. Now, remember, we're trying to become a multinational company. we want to be global marketers. So one of the most obvious clashes is going to be with the culture. Not just the differences in culture between our company and the target market in that particular country, but the clash of cultures amongst the executives. We're an American company, a group of American executives, and we decide that we're going to have a joint venture with a company in France, or a company in China, or a company in Libya. Wherever it is, obviously there's going to be cultural differences. And that could be a source of conflict. And that's not something that's easy to resolve. Even though you might think in some markets the cultural distance is less significant, there's still going to be tension. And that's something that we need to plan for and try to resolve where possible. Right? That's something we need to plan and anticipate for, because you know that's going to come up. People working together of different cultures, even within a particular market, right? So even in the United States is a very diverse market. There's conflict that emerges from people with different backgrounds, different religions, different cultures. Well, just imagine if you actually in a joint venture with a company outside of the U.S. So that's something that we should plan for. So these are some typical modes of entry. Any questions? Are we good? Are we great? Yeah. All right. So let's keep moving forward. We've got another 3 hours. We're almost done. I always think that's funny. But okay. All right. So before we revisit diffusion of innovation, because we talked a little bit about that already, let's go back and talk about country of origin and then branding. What did we say so far about country of origin? Why is that significant? What does that mean, country of origin? This is in chapter 13. Why do we talk about that? Go ahead, tell us.
Well, if if a certain company is originated in a certain country, and they're known to be the elite or the best at what they do, or they created this product, or they basically they are this product, that there's going to be a higher regard for it, I guess, in other countries abroad.
Yes, in that scenario, that's true. It could also work the other way, which is something we need to talk about, because sometimes the country of origin effect could be positive, sometimes it could be negative. Julian?
In terms of straying away from ethnocentricity, like in terms of like getting out of your head, out of your self, what's the self something criterion?
Self-reference criterion.
Self-reference criterion, so that you can enter a new market. You need sometimes other markets, and most of the time other markets have a different culture. So in order to market your product or your service to that country or that town or whatever it is, you need to have a sense of, first of all, country of origin, your own country of origin, and how you're going to separate from that. Like if in America they sell Coca-Cola at McDonald's, you know that, but now you know that in China or wherever it is, maybe they sell beer at McDonald's. So you have to have a sense of self. I'm doing a poor job of articulating, but I think I'm getting the point across. No?
I hear what you're saying, but is there anything else you want to add to that? Yeah, so I mean the self-reference criterion is something that we need to take into consideration, because that's how we're going to make assumptions. That's going to be the basis for our opinion, and in some cases, that means that we make an assumption about a product being produced in a particular market. So if a product is, let's say, made in Italy, if it's a leather briefcase or leather shoes and it says made in Italy, is that a positive country of origin effect or a negative country of origin effect? What do you guys think? Because, as you had suggested,
They're known for leather
right,
or style, design.
absolutely. So there's a positive association with Italian leather-made goods. What about the Swiss?
Chocolate shoes.
Chocolate.
Cheese, yeah.
Army,
Chocolate, and also something important, what? Watches, right?
Banking.
Timepieces, right? Certainly a Swiss-made watch, in terms of country of origin effect, is very positive. So the perception is, if it's a Swiss-made timepiece, if it's a Swiss-made watch, then it's of a better quality.
It's also like the connotation is anything that demands precision, and that extends even to like their banking stuff as well. And like, you know, the chocolate and all the other Swiss things is always very, very, they like things that place high importance on detail orientation.
Yep, that's absolutely part of it. So what we want to do is create strong, unique, and favorable brand associations. So we develop a brand name. So these are some key branding elements. You have the brand name. Once we develop the brand name, we create a logo. What is the logo? The logo is a visual representation, a graphic representation that communicates the brand name. So basically, the brand name is Pepsi. The logo is what you see here. Their symbol is something that looks like that. So the logo is a visual representation of the brand name that contains words. The symbol is a graphic representation that contains no words. So very cleverly, this is called a word mark.
A company can't have one or the other and not necessarily both, right?
You could have one, you need to have, well, yeah, that's an interesting dilemma. You certainly don't need to have both. So Pepsi has a logo and a symbol.
How about Apple?
And Coke has a logo, but not really a symbol. Now, they have a personality symbol, which is like the polar bear. I think you might say that that's their personality symbol.
Santa Claus.
Or they're Santa Claus, or maybe they have more than one personality symbol. But do they really have a symbol? Now, on their packaging, they usually have, some sort of line. Honestly, I wouldn't consider that to be a symbol. Of course, a design of a packaging.
itself is the symbol. There's always the logo and it's in the front of
Well, if you're going to do that, sometimes they do that, but the idea is that what you want to do is create an association between the logo and the symbol. So the idea is that when people see the symbol, right, I think that's what Daniel is alluding to, is that when people see the symbol by itself, that they know that represents the brand. So you don't need to see the logo. Now, why is that important? Especially as we're talking about being global marketers, because if we're going to sell outside of the US, there's a lot of markets where people can't read the Latin alphabet.
It even goes further than that because there's certain colors that have brand associations with them.
Absolutely, that's part of the trade dress. So Kodak, for example, is known for what color? What color is associated with Kodak?
Red.
Well, I'm hearing red, yellow, and what?
Yellow and red. Both.
Purple.
So the most prominent part of their trade dress is certainly the yellow, but their logo also includes red, but certainly yellow. There's this very strong association between the Kodak brand name and the color yellow.
Like Tiffany's patented the color of their boxes. Nobody can use that color but that.
Well, you can't patent a color, you mean a trademark.
No, they patented the color.
How would you, a patent has to do with a certain technology.
Yeah, it was it's the paint production companies that create the colors based on mixing various different other colors together. They figured out a way to actually patent that specific mix.
Interesting. That's very creative. Because one of the challenges with a patent or a trademark is that people try to find ways around that, right? They try to find a way to say that, well, but our patent or our trademark is different. But ultimately, a judge is going to have to decide whether or not we've infringed upon a particular trademark or someone has infringed upon our trademark. And that's why the name Kodak is very compelling, because it's not a word that you could find in a dictionary. And so people can't copy that. I mean, they could, but obviously they're going to be infringing on your trademark. So ideally, you would use a brand name that can't be found in the dictionary, and then create a stylized logo. Because if your brand name is one that is in a dictionary, right, didn't we talk about Apple? Did we talk about Apple? We said, well, what about Apple? Well, yeah, what about Apple? You can't keep people from calling their branded product Apple. There's absolutely no way. I mean, you can't keep people from using words that are in the dictionary.
What's the difference in connotation?
I'm listening.
Meaning, it depends on the situation that the word arises around. If I come up with a computer that's called Apple, I think that would be infringement.
Well, in a particular category, but ultimately a judge is going to have to decide whether or not you've infringed upon the trademark of that company.
You can't with Apple. You can.
Well, like Daniel is saying, if you want to come out with a computer that's branded Apple, right? It's more than likely a judge is going to say that you're infringing upon their trademark. But you can't keep people from coming out with with a line of dinnerware that's called Apple. Right? You don't own the word Apple. Like other people could have a trademark on the name Apple. Right? You can't say, well, we trademarked the word Apple and nobody else could use it. Well, that doesn't sound ridiculous to you?
Yeah.
I mean, that would be what happens. I mean, how many words are there in the dictionary?
13.
So once you trademark them, then what? Then what do the rest of us call our brands?
Well, that was what happened with Sky Vodka. They changed their name to have two Y's that they would be able to have.
Get out of here.
So instead of donuts, what should I bring that instead? Next time? All right, so before we go, so our brand name, what we want to do is create these unique and favorable and strong associations. Certainly one of them could be the country of origin. The country of origin can be a very favorable association with our brand. That's the key to creating an identity for our brand, is creating these associations with our brand and other items or categories or perceptions. to create value in the marketplace. And I just want to tell you briefly before we go, in chapter 13, there's a list of some of the most valuable brands. And what do you think is the brand that's considered to be the most valuable?
Coca-Cola.
And its value is?
A lot.
How much? $1 million? $2 million? How much?
Apple.
3.7 billion?
But it's not
More than that.
It's in the trillions.
The trillions, okay.
just because the name carries so much
$68 billion. That's just the value of the Coke brand.
They don't actually have that much money, it's just that the name is so recognizable, that's how much it would be worth if they were willing to give us that name.
Are you asking me or telling me? So the present value of future cash flows is $68 billion. That's not the value of their corporate headquarters. It's not the value of their manufacturing facility. It's not the value of their office equipment, right? It's just the value of their brand. All right, so we'll talk more about some of the other top brands next time. All right, so have a good night. Do good things. Thanks, Coach.
Coach, please. Coach, please. All right. I hate Mondays. I hate Mondays.
It's very interesting that they actually got a patent for that. All right, see you guys.
Big thing, everybody was.
Yeah, no, that's a very